Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to sew a French seam. So a French seam is a way of basically enclosing your seam, the raw edge of your seam, so that when you look on the inside of a garment, it's nice and clean and you don't have any raw edges on your seams. Okay, so here I have two pieces of fabric that I'll sew together using the French seam. The right side is the side with the lines that you can see, and then here's the wrong side with nothing. Okay, so let's go ahead to the sewing machine and start sewing this. Alright, so the first thing we want to do, typically when we sew a seam, we put right sides together. When you're doing the French seam, you actually put wrong sides together. So I'm going to start by putting our wrong sides together and lining up my cut edge. And then we're actually going to end up sewing this twice, one with wrong sides together and one with right sides together. Okay, so for the case of this seam, and you can sew a French seam with any amount of seam allowance, really, as long as it's not too small. But in this case, we're going to do 3/4. All right, and I'm going to end up with a 1/4 inch French seam. Typically, where I used to work, we end up with 1/8 of an inch, but just so you can see it easier, we're going to do a 1/4 inch. Okay, so again, we have a 3/4 inch seam allowance. The first row of stitching I'm going to do is at a 1/2 inch. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to sew this at a 1/2 inch, and I have wrong sides together, and I'm going to back tack beginning and end. There we go. There we go. I've sewed a 1/2 inch seam allowance with wrong sides together. Alright, let's go to the ironing board. Alright, we're at the iron. So the first thing I need to do is, because I'm going to have my seam finished at a 1/4 of an inch, I need to trim back this seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. Because what I've just sewn is going to be what ends up enclosed inside the tunnel that we create, that is the French seam. Okay, so again, I'm going to trim this back to 1/8 of an inch, like so. There we go. And now I'm going to press this seam. Let's press it flat real quick. I'm going to open this up, and since it's so small, I'm just going to press it to one side. Clean. Like so. Alright, so I have that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, press to one side. Okay, this is what the right side looks like right now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the seam flat. Okay, bringing that seam allowance right out to the edge here, and I press that nice and flat, and this will make it easier to sew that next row of stitching. Okay, so I've put right sides of my fabric together, and I've pressed that flat. Okay, so now what we're going to go do is we're going to go to the sewing machine and stitch this at a 1/4 of an inch from that seam I just created. Okay, and what that will do is, you can see my raw edge here of my seam allowance. That will enclose that, clean finishing this. Okay, so let's go ahead to the sewing machine. Alright, we're at the sewing machine. I'm going to do this next row of stitching at a 1/4 of an inch. Again, I started out with 3/4 of an inch, and I stitched a 1/2 inch, which leaves me with a 1/4 of an inch, and now I'm going to stitch my 1/4 of an inch, and that will neaten up all the seam allowance like we want. Alright, here we go. 1/4 inch seam allowance. Back tack beginning and end. Alright. Okay, so there it is, stitched at a 1/4 of an inch. I have a seam here, and then there's my French seam. Let's go to the iron and press that. So I'm going to go ahead and press this flat first. And then I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to press the seam allowance to one side. Now with darts, you usually press your dart seam allowance to the center. In the case with French seams, there's no rule of which direction you have to press them. So just press them so it's consistent around the body. Okay? So if you press them all towards the back, press one towards the back, press them all towards the back. If you press one towards the front, press them all towards the front. All right? So there it is. That is the French seam. This is the right side. Looks just like a normal seam. And then here's the wrong side. And we've created that channel that the raw edge is enclosed, giving you a nice clean finish on the inside. And that's the French seam.